Chapter 5. The Unspoken Surrender. The alliance forged in the crucible of the council chamber had settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Their secret war had become a secret council. During the day, Alara was the perfect hostage, serene and distant. Kalen was the unapproachable Shadow Lord. But beneath the surface, the tether hummed with a new purpose. A subtle question from him about a rival lord's loyalty would be met with a wave of projected trust from her, a gut feeling he could use to his advantage. A flicker of her fear for her people's fate would be answered by a stern, reassuring pulse of order and control from him. It was a dangerous intimacy, more profound than any physical touch. They were learning the texture of each other's minds, the cadence of each other's thoughts. The line between captor and captive had blurred into a partnership so perilous that to acknowledge it aloud would be to destroy it. For the first time in months, Alara was granted permission to walk in the small cloistered garden nestled deep within the citadel's walls. It was a concession, a reward for her cooperation. The garden was a stark, beautiful place of hardy mountain flora, iron-veined rock, brilliant mosses, and pale, hardy blossoms that clung to life with fierce tenacity. It was a fitting reflection of her own survival. She was tracing the pattern of frost on a dark green leaf when the world erupted. Two figures dropped from the battlements above, landing with the silent grace of hunting cats. They were not clad in the black and silver of the Iron Spire Guard. They wore dark, unmarked leather, their faces obscured by shadows and grim purpose assassins. Her scream was swallowed by the wind. Her two guards, slow-footed and complacent from weeks of peaceful duty, were dead before they could fully draw their blades. One fell with a knife in his throat, the other with a brutal slash that opened him from shoulder to hip. It was swift, efficient, and utterly terrifying. Alara stumbled back, her heel catching on a stone root. She fell hard onto the frozen ground, the icy shock stealing her breath. One of the assassins turned toward her, a long, wicked-looking dagger glinting in the pale light. His eyes, visible slits in his leather mask, were devoid of all emotion. This wasn't personal, it was an execution. This was Vorlak's answer to Kylan's victory in the council. There was no time for a calculated projection, no time for a clever mental strategy. There was only pure primal terror. As the assassin lunged, a single wordless shriek of absolute fear ripped through the sovereign's tether. It was not a message, it was a raw nerve exposed and screaming. A black thunderbolt crashed into the garden. Kylan moved faster than she could have conceived. He had come from the covered walkway connecting to the main keep, drawn by the psychic scream of her terror. He held no ornate sword, only the heavy practical blade he always wore at his side. He met the first assassin's lunge not with a parry, but with a brutal, unstoppable force. He slammed the man's dagger arm aside with his armored forearm and drove his own sword through the assassin's chest in a single, fluid motion. There was no hesitation, no mercy. The man was dead before his body hit the ground. The second assassin, seeing his partner fall, abandoned his target and threw his dagger at Kalen. Kalen moved his head a mere inch, the blade hissing past his ear to shatter against the stone wall behind him. Before the assassin could draw a second weapon, Kalen was on him. The fight was not a duel, it was a storm. It was the brutal, deadly grace of the training yard made real and final. A block, a twist, and the assassin's own knife was at his throat. There was a sickening crunch, and the second body fell beside the first. Silence descended, broken only by the howling wind and Kylan's ragged breaths. He stood over the dead men, his sword dripping crimson onto the pale flowers. His chest rose and fell, his entire body radiating a lethal energy. He was splattered with their blood, a true vision of the Shadow Lord, the conqueror, the killer. He turned his head, and his sledge-gray eyes found her on the ground. The cold fury in them was terrifying, but it was not directed at her. It was the fury of a man whose most prized possession had been threatened. He strode to her side, his presence eclipsing the sky. He did not offer a hand. He simply stared down at her, his jaw clenched, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Alara stared back up at him, her body trembling uncontrollably. All her defiance, all her carefully constructed walls of hatred and pride had been annihilated. She wasn't looking at her conqueror, she was looking at the man who had just saved her life. He was a monster, yes, but he had been her monster. He barked an order to the guards now swarming the garden entrance. Stay with the princess, no one enters. No one leaves. Then, without another word to her, he turned and stalked away, leaving her in the care of his men, alone with the cooling bodies and the overwhelming smell of blood. Back in her chambers, wrapped in a thick fur blanket by a trembling Lyra, she still could not get warm. The cold was bonnet dip, a residue of fear. The games were over. This was real. The strategic whispers, the mental jousting, it all seemed like a foolish child's fantasy in the face of cold, sharp steel. She was alive because of him. The man she had dedicated every waking thought to hating and tormenting had shielded her with his own body. The contradiction was a wound in her soul. Lying in her bed, staring into the flickering firelight, she felt the familiar hum of the tether. For this time, she did not reach for it with intent. Her own soul reached for it, raw and bleeding. Her fear had subsided, replaced by a vast, hollow ache, and in that hollow space gratitude bloomed, tangled inextricably with the terror. She closed her eyes, and, without conscious thought, she surrendered. Every barrier she had ever erected, every bit of pride, every scheme, every fantasy of vengeance or control dissolved. She sent no images, no clever words. She simply opened the floodgates of her spirit and let the raw, unvarnished truth pour down the tether. Kaylin. Her mental voice was not a whisper or a command. It was a plea, fragile and broken. Don't leave me. Stay, please. It was a complete and total abdication of her power, a soul-bearing confession of her terror and her desperate, unwilling reliance on him. It was an admission that in that frozen garden, the only safety she felt in the entire world was in the shadow of the monster who had just killed for her. It was the ultimate surrender. The response was instantaneous and violent. A tidal wave of chaotic, tormented emotion crashed back into her. Shock, rage, and that dark, possessive hunger, now amplified 1,000 times and burning with an agony that mirrored her own. The heady door to her chamber burst open, slamming against the stone wall with a crack like thunder. Kaylin stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. His face was a mask of torment, his eyes wild. He had shed his blood-splattered tunic and wore only a simple black shirt, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war within himself and had just finally lost. He strode into the room, each step heavy with grim finality. "This ends now," he snarled, his voice a raw, ragged thing. "The games, the whispers, all of it. I will not be haunted by you any longer." He reached her bed in 2 long strides, looming over her. She shrank back against the pillows, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the controlled ruler or the cold-blooded killer. This was a man utterly undone. And then he was leaning down, his hands bracketing her head, his fingers tangling in the silver of her hair. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes burning with a desperate, furious light. "Fantasy is not enough," he growled, the words a confession ripped from the depths of his soul. And then his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an explosion. It was desperate and punishing, a violent collision of anger and need, of fear and forbidden longing. It was a taste of iron and ozone, of power and surrender. It was the desperate, explosive reality of 1,000 shared secrets and unspoken desires, finally, irrevocably brought into the light. The fantasy was over. The cage had just become something else entirely.